One of the questions that persists in journalism is, where do we get our information? And there are actually three tracks, and I think they apply to any story. The first, obviously, is people, but that doesn't mean just going to one person or one source. It means checking everything, talking to half a dozen or even a dozen people for a day story. If it's something longer, you want to totally surround and saturate the subject. Second track is documents. I have not really ever seen a story in a newspaper or on television or even on radio that couldn't be enhanced with some sort of documentation that would support or add more detail to what the story is about. And the third, often if you ask people, well, what's the third, they don't get it. And I would tell an anecdote from my early reporting career to illustrate the importance of the third track. In the first months I started working at the Washington Post in 1971, I had developed a source in the local District of Columbia Health Department, and they were doing inspections of restaurants, many of the famous restaurants in Washington, and closing them down for sanitation violations. And we were doing front page stories on this, and one day the source called me up and said, we have the worst score that any restaurant in the District of Columbia has ever received. And I won't go through the gross details about what was floating in the food and so forth. So I went and got the document, and at a newspaper, even then, they like to get early copy. So I wrote out the story about lunchtime or maybe even before lunch. And the story said and the document made it clear that the coffee shop, the Mayflower Coffee Shop as it was called, was the restaurant that had been closed down with a score of less than 50 points. And I wrote up the story based on the document. The coffee shop at the Mayflower Hotel, one of the famous restaurants in Washington, and handed it to the city editor, and he said, here's early copy, and he was delighted, and he said, wow, this is a front page story. Wow, that's an awful series of violations. And then he said, have you been there? And I said, no, I've got the document. No, it's authentic. He said, well, it's 2.5 blocks away. Get your ass out of the chair and get over there. So I went to the Mayflower Hotel and asked to visit the coffee shop. Everyone there said, we don't have a coffee shop. We have a famous Jean-Louis or something restaurant. We have a buffet, but no coffee shop. So I looked at the address of the Mayflower Coffee Shop, and it turned out not to be in the Mayflower Hotel, but in the Statler Hilton Hotel, which was a half a block away from the Washington Post. So I went over there and found the Mayflower Coffee Shop, and they had a big sign saying closed for repairs. The man who ran the restaurant happily but reluctantly acknowledged, yes, they'd been closed down for all of these violations. And I went back to the Post and asked the editor for the copy back, and I said I had a few minor changes to make. And if we'd run the story without me getting my ass out of the chair and going to the scene, we probably would have had to run a front page correction also. I think there will always be investigative or in-depth reporting. Clearly the newspapers are going through a convulsion now. It may last a long time, but young people are going to develop new business models. Everyone, all age groups, realize it's important to have good data, good information about what government does. I asked Ben Bradley, who is the editor of the Post, what he thought, and he said, look, it's going to change. But then with great passion, he said there will always be a group of people, a band of brothers, a band of sisters, a band of brothers and sisters working to get to the underlayer of what's going on, and they will find a way to publish or broadcast or convey what they believe the truth to be.